polls, Washington Post. Should the wealthiest people in this country be asked to pay more? That's the question. And they asked, in order to reduce the national debt, would you support or oppose the following question: raising taxes on Americans with incomes of over $250,000 a year? 72% of the American people in that poll said yes, 27 said no. Overwhelmingly, every poll that we see says the wealthy have got to pay more in taxes, and then these same polls say protect Social Security, protect Medicare, protect Medicaid, protect education. And here's the irony. We are marching down a path which will do exactly opposite of what the American people want. Our Republican friends have been absolutely fanatically determined that no matter what happens, billionaires and large corporations will not pay a nickel more in taxes. That has been their religious belief, not a nickel more from the wealthiest people in this country. And I have to say, Mr. President, Democrats have not been particularly strong in opposition to that, nor has the President been strong. Retreat after retreat after retreat. So in recent months, we have heard more and more discussion from Democrats about cuts in Social Security, cuts in Medicare, cuts in Medicaid. And now there is apparently a willingness to come forward with a proposal that would include only cuts and no revenue at all. No revenue at all. So, Mr. President, I think the American people are angry. I think they are frustrated. I think they are disillusioned, because what they want to see happen is deficit reduction done through shared sacrifice, through the wealthy and large corporations playing their role, appears not to be happening. And when they have said loudly and clearly that we must protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, they are also seeing that that is not happening. So, Mr. President, I would just conclude that I think there is a path to a deficit reduction which is fair and responsible. It does ask the big money interests to understand they are Americans also. They have got to play a role in deficit reduction. It does say that at a time when we have tripled military spending since 1997, we have got to make significant cuts there as well. So, Mr. President, I would hope that our Republican friends would give up their fanatic opposition to asking billionaires and millionaires and large corporations from playing a role in deficit reduction. I would hope my Democratic friends would stand tall, and I would hope that at the end of the day we would have a deficit reduction program that the American people would feel good about. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
The Senator from Maryland.
First, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that an intern, Charlie Valio Anderson, have the privileges of the floor for the balance of the day from Senator Merkley's office.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would also ask unanimous consent that I could speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we all know that on Tuesday we're running against the deadline on raising the debt of our nation. And there's a real risk that if we don't make that deadline on Tuesday, there will be checks from the federal government that will not be able to go out. The 70 million number is used, the number of checks that are written each month by the federal government that go to employees, to go to contractors, to go to recipients of certain benefits. But let me talk about 4,000 federal workers who already have been furloughed. And it doesn't have to do with raising the debt ceiling. It has to do with the failure of the House of Representatives to send a clean extension of the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA reauthorization bill, for us to consider. As a result of the failure to pass a reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration or to pass a short-term extension of the FAA, 4,000 workers at the Federal Aviation Administration have been put on furlough. That in and of itself has a major impact on our economy. That's 4,000 Americans who are no longer receiving a paycheck. It affects people that work for the FAA in such fields as safety engineers, computer scientists, aeronautics engineers, physical scientists, and the list goes on and on, jeopardizing the progress that we've made in keeping our airways safe and jeopardizing the convenience to those who travel by air. Many of those workers live in the state of Maryland, so it's having a direct effect on the state that I have the honor of representing in the United States Senate. But, Mr. President, it goes beyond just the federal workforce that have been put on furlough as a result of the failure to pass a short-term extension of the FAA. It also goes to construction contracts that are funded through the aviation funds. In many airports around the nation, there have been now stop orders on construction of runways, construction of towers, constructions of other improvements that are important to keep our airports modern and safe and convenient and handling the increased number of air passengers. But let me tell you, yes, it affects those large contractors who were doing work for the federal government. It's going to affect their payrolls. It's going to affect their workforce. But it also affects a lot of small businesses in Maryland and around the nation. Let me just give you one example. Chappie Corporation is an electrical and mechanical operations small business specializing in airport landing and systems and lighting. Chappie Construction is the lead contractor implementing BWI, the main airport in Maryland, ASDE-X project, a runway safety mechanism that enables air traffic controllers to detect potential runway conflicts by providing detailed coverage of movement on runways and taxiways. Well, for the safety of all of us, I would hope that we would want to move forward with that type of improvements in our major airports in the nation, including the one in which most Marylanders use, BWI Airport. Chappie Construction Corporation has been told to stop work on this important aviation safety project and decreasing their value and making it more difficult to make payroll. It's already tough for small companies out there today, and now because of the failure of the House to send over to us a clean extension of the FAA bill, which we've done many times in the past, we have a company like Chappie, which is running the risk of its strength to continue, of its current workforce, and to do important work at an airport on safety. But let me tell you, it also goes beyond just the federal employees and the contractors who are employees that are not getting a paycheck, to contractors whose work have been stopped and they're not getting their construction contract payments. It's going to affect their payment. It also affects the Federal Aviation Administration's revenues. They collect a lot of revenues. There's a ticket tax. When you buy an airline ticket, you pay a tax that goes into the Federal Aviation Administration's funds, which are used to fund the projects such as improvements to our airports. That amounts to about $30 million. That will not be collected. Now, what happens to that money? Well, we lose it in the Federal Treasury. So you will say, well, maybe it'll make it a little bit less expensive for people to travel. But that's not the case. Let me just quote from Reuters. On a headline, airlines raise fares as taxes lapse. And I'm quoting, many U.S. airlines have raised fares in recent days to take advantage of a lapse in U.S. ticket tax collections after Congress failed last week to fully fund the Federal Aviation Administration's budget. But passengers are not likely to notice any price difference. JetBlue Airway Corporation, Southwest Airlines Company, began raising ticket prices by at least 7.5% on Friday, according to FareCompare.com. Other airlines, such as Delta Airlines, United Continental Holding, Inc., boosted prices on Saturday, end quote. So we can't collect the 7.5% tax. The airlines are pocketing the money. The people who are purchasing tickets are still paying the same amount, even though none of that money is going to improve our airports. It makes no sense whatsoever. All of these occurrences, federal workers not getting a paycheck, being put on furlough, contractors not getting paid and construction work not being done, revenues not being collected that are necessary for the federal government, all are hurting our economy. All are making it more difficult for our recovery. Now, why is this happening? Well, the reason, quite frankly, is that we have not been able to pass the reauthorization bill. Let me tell you, the House passed, we passed the reauthorization bill early this session. The Senate did. The House sent us the bill about, passed the bill about 100 days ago, but has refused to appoint conferees to work out the differences. And then the House sends us over, because we didn't meet the deadline, an extension bill that includes a partisan labor provision, an anti-labor provision. Now, that should never be in an extension bill. It shouldn't be in any legislation. But it should be negotiated between the conferees, between the House and Senate, so we can get a reauthorization bill done. They shouldn't use an extension bill in order to get that done. And that's what they've done. As a result, we had the consequences of federal workers being furloughed, contractors not being paid, and revenues necessary for airport improvement not being collected. Well, what should we do? What do we need to do? Well, we need to first pass a short-term extension, what we call a clean short-term extension, without these killer amendments attached to it, to allow our workforce to be able to work and get their paychecks, to allow contractors to continue the work that they're doing, and the government to collect the revenues necessary to keep our airports modern. That's the first thing we should do. And then secondly, Mr. President, we need to negotiate in good faith between the House and Senate conferees so that we can pass the Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization bill. That bill contains many very important provisions, including what we call Next Gen, which is the way in which we can operate our air service in a much more efficient way, using less fuel, less time, and helping our economy. The FAA reauthorization bill is estimated to create hundreds of thousands of jobs for our country. We need to get that done. So we need to negotiate the bill, get that done, and all that will help create more jobs for our community. So I urge my colleagues, particularly those in the House, to send us a clean extension bill, negotiate in good faith. Let's get the FAA bill done. And with that, Mr. President, I see actually the ranking member on that committee who might wish to talk about that or some other issue, our colleague from Texas, and with that I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I was here to talk about the renomination of the FBI Director Mueller, but I certainly heard my colleague from Maryland, and I agree that we must extend a clean extension of the FAA. We are losing the revenue and we are losing the capability for projects that are ongoing to continue. Work has stopped at many of the airports that have building and repair projects going that are supported by the FAA, and honestly, the House needs to send a clean extension. There is a clean extension pending in the Senate. It has been objected to by one member, but this is not the way to go forward. I happen to agree with much of what the House wants to do, but not in this way. We have to put that in the context of the whole bill, which we certainly should be doing. And I hope that the House will send us a clean extension so there will not be another weekend of disruption and people can get on with the projects. I did come to talk about the FBI Director, Robert Mueller. He has been FBI director since 2001, during a critical time when our country has experienced such major leadership changes on our national security team. This offers the necessary stability and continuity from a proven leader who has wide support. Director Mueller has strong bipartisan support. He was appointed in 2001, August 2nd, just before the 9/11 tragedy by President Bush, and he began serving a week before the September 11 attacks. His term is set to expire next week on August 2nd. The FBI has never experienced a larger transformation than while under his leadership, adding counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and cybersecurity to the Bureau's traditional crime-fighting mission. In the 10 years while Mr. Mueller has been director of the FBI, he has worked tirelessly to ensure no international terrorist attacks have occurred on U.S. soil since 9/11. And there have been several plots that have been uncovered and kept from occurring. Director Mueller has ensured that the FBI is a full member of the U.S. intelligence community and serves as a critical and singular link between the intelligence and law enforcement communities in the United States. He has served our nation with valor and integrity as a Marine in Vietnam and as a federal prosecutor. He answered the call to service from President Bush to be FBI director and is once again answering the call by agreeing to serve 2 more years under President Obama. He is an admirable public servant, and I urge his swift confirmation. Mr. President, we are less than 6 days away from the date the Department of Treasury has signified would shut down the federal government and exhaust all borrowing authority. We all know that we are at this point because we have a fundamental difference in the principles on how our government should be run. We all know that we are at this point because the financial viability of our nation is at stake. I believe that this debt ceiling debate presents Congress with a critical opportunity to get our country back on a sustainable and prosperous path. We must send a message to the markets, to the American people, and to American businesses that we are going to get our fiscal house in order with spending cuts, caps on future spending, and permanent budget reform in the form of a balanced budget amendment. What we need now is a serious proposal to provide certainty and clear commitment to a reform measure that ensures spending cuts before the debt ceiling is raised. The Senate Majority Leader and the House Speaker's plans have similarities, and I believe that a common ground can be found in the two. First, neither of the plans proposes tax increases to achieve deficit reduction, and both plans aim for significant deficit savings in the amount of $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, is that what we wanted? Is that what I would have written if I could have been the czar? No, I would have had more cuts. We should be reaching for $4 trillion cuts, not 1.2. But we have had plans put forward for $4 trillion. We've had plans put forward for more, and we couldn't get those through. We couldn't get one through the Senate. We couldn't get one through the House. And furthermore, entitlements are not on the drawing boards right now in the plans that are before us, and entitlement reform is essential for us to address. We can certainly put Social Security on the fiscally responsible path that will make it secure for 75 years with very minor changes and gradual changes if we do it now. This is an opportunity. Because we have only 6 days, we're not going to be able to do it in this vehicle. But there is a plan going forward that our leaders, Senator McConnell and Senator Reid, along with a bipartisan group of senators, have put forward that actually will have entitlement reform. And I think we need to look at those for the longer term and not let this opportunity pass to do something that will be enduring for the fiscal responsibility of our country. But we have 6 days. And now we have to do something as responsible as possible with the time that we have left and keep open the option of doing what we should be doing for the long term before the end of this year. That's what Senator McConnell, Senator Reid, many other senators have put on the table. That is what we need to try to achieve. But we have made great strides. What Republicans said from the beginning is we're not going to support tax increases of any kind in this economic climate. Businesses are not hiring. A 9.1% unemployment rate is unacceptable. Our businesses are afraid of the Obama health care plan and its costs, and they're factoring that in to their plans, and they're not hiring people because of the expense. You add more tax increases on top of that, and our economy is going to be stagnant for a long time. So tax increases were off the table. But I do hope that we can also make the cuts that will put us on a fiscally responsible plan so we will not have to address this debt ceiling ever again. So we have made a major achievement. Sometimes it seems like when you have to come together to do something that isn't ideal, you don't take acknowledgement of the fact that you are making one smaller step in the right direction. And I think in order to avoid a fiscal calamity, we do need to make the strongest step that we can make, which is cutting spending and doing it without increasing taxes. The idea that we could tax our way out of debt has been totally discounted. Neither of these plans includes tax hikes to offset the deficit reduction, and that is a strong endorsement. Both proposals also include budget enforcement of discretionary caps by requiring automatic across-the-board cuts if the caps are not met. That will put a governor on future spending that will keep the promise that we are making to cut spending. Both proposals establish a bipartisan committee to identify further deficit reduction that would include tax reform and fixing the broken entitlement programs. I hope that we will not throw that out the window. Having a commission, I know people roll their eyes and say, oh, another commission, really? Well, if we have a finite end date and have the opportunity to make more real cuts, it's worth another chance. We do need to make entitlement reforms, and if we can do tax reform that lowers the tax rate for everyone and brings in revenue by having more people hired off the unemployment rolls, that's a win. We raise revenue by putting more people back to work. That's the way you raise revenue, not by tax increases that puts a lid on hiring. So I think we've got some good things that can be put together. We need to make sure that we go forward as much as we can with a divided Congress and try to make a step in the right direction, and then hopefully before the end of the year we will be able to take stronger steps that will have a more lasting impact. I, for one, think it is not even a possibility that we would allow the debt ceiling to be met and start the process then of watching the President decide who gets paid and who doesn't. Now, I have a bill that I have introduced with strong support that would make the priority paying the interest on our debt and paying our soldiers, our men and women who have boots on the ground in harm's way. If you're on active duty military, you shouldn't waste 1 minute thinking about whether you're going to make your mortgage. And, Mr. President, I want to say that I commend USAA. USAA is the corporation that services so many of our service personnel, and they have put out their policy in case the debt limit is reached and we haven't come to an accommodation, that not one of their customers in the military will have to worry about their paychecks. They are going to cover in an advance the paycheck that that military person would be entitled to, because they have faith that eventually we will meet our obligations in Congress and everything will be okay. They also know the stresses on those members of the armed services. USAA is doing a wonderful thing by putting those families of loved ones across the sea fighting for our security at ease, because they will know that their mortgage payment is going to go out of their bank account and they're not going to have to worry about the things that they need as their children are starting school in the next month wherever they are. So, Mr. President, I commend USAA. At the same time, I would like for my bill to be passed that assures that those who are not customers of USAA will also have the comfort of knowing that their paychecks will be there on time. And so I hope that if all else fails in this body, that we can pass the legislation that says we'll pay our debts and we will pay our military, and Social Security recipients will also be paid from that account. But I don't think we ought to get that far at all, and that's why I am urging our members to work with our leaders. Don't throw stones at our leaders. I mean, they have a tough job corralling 100 pretty big egos, and we ought to be helping them get to the point where we're all comfortable that we are doing the right thing. And sometimes you can't get 100% of what you want when there are 100 people who have their individual ideas as well. So, Mr. President, I hope that we will take this chance to do so much for our country that we have the opportunity to do, and we may have to do it in smaller steps to reach that goal. But if we reach the goal, we will have secured the future for our children, and that is what we're here for. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to express my support for the Majority Leader's plan to raise the debt ceiling and reduce the deficit. Our nation, as we all know, faces a looming crisis. The markets have already warned us. Businesses are already postponing investments. We know the consequences of inaction. They are predictable. Borrowing costs for businesses and individuals will escalate. Interest payments on the debt will grow, and already anemic job growth will decline. Our nation will run the risk of another financial catastrophe and possibly a return to recession. As Chairman Bernanke recently stated, the outcome would be calamitous. Many Americans are struggling. Far too many remain out of work. They cannot be asked to absorb the shockwaves of yet another failure to act. It's time, as the senator from Texas just pointed out and others have, for both sides and both chambers to find common ground. Reasonable and responsible editorials from across the country have endorsed the Majority Leader's proposal. Well-meaning people on all sides have a genuine concern, have shown genuine concerns. We all, most all of us, share those concerns about the implications of not acting. There are, in the other party, some individuals who view themselves as revolutionaries in the best sense of the word. They appear less concerned with the here and now than with where they want to take the country in the future. And we all understand that the two are connected and that looking to the future is vital to the country. The question, though, is the harm that might be caused by precipitous action. Columnist George Will wrote a column a few days ago likening the Tea Party movement of today to the beginning of the Goldwater-Reagan conservative era, that the Goldwater movement of 1964, even though it did not bring Senator Goldwater to the presidency, was the first step toward the conservative revolution that culminated in Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. Mr. Will wrote, and I'm going to quote a couple of sentences. The Tea Party, which in his view is the most welcome development since the Goldwater insurgency in 1964, lacks only the patience necessary when America lacks the consensus required to propel fundamental change. Mr. Will goes on to say, if Washington's trajectory could be turned as quickly as Tea Partiers wish, their movement would not be as necessary as it is. Those are Mr. Will's words. That is Mr. Will's considered opinion. And that may be so, and it may not be so. But the first rule of good governance is to do no harm. That doesn't mean we shouldn't make cuts. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look towards some of the directions that this debate has taken us. But it means be careful when you're dealing with the fragility of national policy at a time like this. Some things sound better in a speech to a room full of activists than they actually are in the reality of how you govern and the practicality of how you actually bring about change where change is needed. Senator Goldwater did not attempt to torpedo the economy in order to get his way. And Ronald Reagan, in whose administration I proudly served, by the way, raised the national debt 18 times, more than any other president. Mr. President, I fought in Vietnam as an infantry Marine. I'm very proud of that. And those of us who did fight in Vietnam all remember the regretful quote of one infantry officer who lamented that during one battle he had to call in heavy artillery and airstrikes on a populated village, that he had to destroy a village in order to save it. I don't think the Republicans who are using this issue as a lever to bring about their view of radical change want to look back at a fractured economic recovery, a downgraded credit rating for the world's #1 economy, a citizenry that has become more angry, less capable of predicting its own financial future, and then say, as if all of this were not predictable, that they destroyed the American economy in order to save it. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
President, I know my distinguished colleague from a senior senator from West Virginia is going to be seeking recognition, and perhaps others, and I certainly have no objection to that. I realize we're on the Mueller nomination, but I understand that notwithstanding any interruption, or I'd ask consent that notwithstanding any interruption for other business, that the Mueller vote still be at the time we originally planned, which was around 4 o'clock.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield the floor. I yield to my distinguished colleague, the senior senator from West Virginia.
I thank the good senator very much.
Senator from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last week I came to the Senate floor to ask unanimous consent to pass something called, a very easy thing called a clean extension of the FAA bill, something that the Senate has done 20 times. This is the 21st time. 4 years of waiting to pass a reauthorization bill. But for the first time in these 4 years, the Republicans objected to this extraordinarily routine request. Shortly, I will renew my request to pass our 21st short-term extension of the FAA. But before I do, I want to highlight the very painful consequences of failing to pass this bill, which we can only do by getting a clean extension. By objecting to my request last week, Republican senators made sure that 4,000 hardworking FAA employees were furloughed already. Hundreds of critical airport safety, capacity, air traffic control projects were brought to a halt. Payments were stopped to hundreds of small businesses dependent upon reimbursement from the FAA for their work. The federal government is being forced to forego almost $30 million a day, Mr. President, in aviation tax revenue that is critical, obviously, to supporting our overall airport infrastructure program. And the introduction of the newest Boeing aircraft are being delayed because the FAA cannot certify that the planes operate safely. I know in Washington we have a tendency to view these fights as purely policy disagreements that have no real impact on people. What I want to stress here is that there's enormous effect on people and businesses, large and small, and on the economy of the United States. Because some Republicans have refused to allow another clean extension of the FAA program, something which we have done 20 times in the last 4 years, we're inflicting real pain on very, very real people. People are suffering, small businesses are hurting, and we are losing jobs, and we'll lose a lot more. Even consumers are losing out on airline tax, ticket tax holidays. The majority of the airline industry has greedily chosen to pocket those revenues rather than reducing ticket prices. In other words, they have a tax holiday because the expiration of the taxes has already taken place a number of days ago. So what they're doing is they're taking this tax holiday, and rather than leaving at the present level the cost of a ticket for consumers, as Alaska Airlines is doing and Virgin Airlines is doing and one other airline is doing, they're taking the money to themselves, giving it to themselves. And I just find that extraordinary. It reminds me of Too Big to Fail, the movie, the greed. The promise to help with small mortgages, they got all the money and then didn't spend a dime of it on helping with mortgages. That's what it reminds me of. The damage we are doing to our aviation system is incredibly real. And if we fail to act in a timely manner, it may be so devastating as to become irreversible. When you think about it, it does make sense. If you operate on somebody and cut beyond a certain point, you can't reverse the damage. With so much pain being inflicted on so many, you may ask why my Republican colleagues have refused repeated requests to pass a clean extension, something we have done 20 times in the past 4 years. They are willing, evidently, to hurt so many of the benefit, just many people for the benefit of one company. It's called Delta Airlines. The chairman of the House Transportation Committee has stated publicly the House inserted language on the Essential Air Service program. We need that to leverage the Senate on including provisions on relating to the National Mediation Board. Now, what do I mean by that? What they sent over to us was all about Essential Air Service, but that's not what it's about at all. The chairman of my corresponding chairman over in the House has told me many times that the Essential Air Service is not a big deal to him. He doesn't particularly have a dog in his hunt. We need to do some reform of it, which we've offered to do. But he didn't mention a thing about the National Mediation Board. That is the only thing which motivates the House. Delta Airlines is non-union. The other airlines, for the most part, are union. Delta Airlines has had 4 elections in the last several years to unionize. Each time the company has prevailed over the union. So you might ask, why is it that they are so strongly suggesting that they need this National Mediation Board, which they changed. It was in their bill. It had been changed 2 years ago to say that the number of votes that were cast were the number of votes that were reflected. But now in their bill, what they want to say is that anybody who does not vote in a union certification election, by definition, has voted no. Well, I've never heard of that in America anywhere else, and it's a rather ridiculous ploy. So this is not policy. It's pettiness. It has become the typical my way or the highway thinking of House Republicans. And I would note that we have foregone almost $150 million in tax revenues by failing to act. And it will go up by about $25 million a day, which, when you think about it, would come close to paying for the whole Essential Air Service program anyway in just a week or so. So, again, by the end of the week, we will have lost more revenue used for aviation infrastructure spending than on the entire Essential Air Service program cost all of last year. It's embarrassing. I wish my Republican colleagues would have defended the prerogatives of the Senate. Instead, some chose to back the House leadership. Last year, as my friend from Utah, who's here now, outlined so honestly last week, Senate Republicans are not permitting the Senate to pass a clean extension because they want the Senate to accept language altering 85 years of labor law and legal precedent. I wish I understood why the policy objections of one company, Delta Airlines, mattered so much to so few, and also mattered so much more than the livelihood of thousands of American workers who have been or will shortly be furloughed. Last year, the CEO of Delta made $9 million. Whether that was his salary or salary plus options, I know not. Delta paid its top executives almost $20 million. Yet it's fighting to make sure its employees cannot organize. They've already had 4 elections. All 4 Delta has prevailed, for fear that they may secure a few extra dollars in their checks for their workers. At the same time, it's pushing for special interest provisions in the FAA bill. Delta is not shy. Delta announced it was abandoning air service to 26 small rural communities, leaving many of them, obviously, without any service. You only have to live in a small rural community or state like mine to understand what that means and what the cost really is. Delta then had the gall to announce publicly it would seek EAS, Essential Air Service, subsidies to continue this service. Maybe Mr. Anderson and his colleagues could forego some of their own salaries to help subsidize the air service. That's not my business. Maybe they could use some of the millions of dollars they are collecting in a tax holiday windfall to pay for this service. That is not my business. But it is theirs, and it is shameful. Let me be clear. House Republicans and their Senate allies have thrown nearly 4,000 FAA employees out of work already, stopped critical airport safety projects, hurt hundreds of small businesses, and gutted the Aviation Trust Fund, or began to, so that Delta Airlines, that one company, doesn't have to allow its employees to organize in a fair or timely manner if they chose to. The needs of one company should not, in any deliberative body, dictate the safety and soundness of our aviation system. We need to pass a clean extension that will get people back to work and businesses and their employees back to work and building out our airport infrastructure. It's so simple, Mr. President. It's so simple just to pass a clean extension bill. We've done it so often. We've done it 20 times. The one time where there was some policy attached was 2 years ago when the House and the Senate totally agreed on what was in the extension, and it passed. But it's such a simple thing to do. And by not doing it, it's holding up our whole process. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that, as if in the legislative session, the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar number 109, H.R. 2553, that a Rockefeller-Hutchison substitute amendment, which is at the desk, be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there an objection?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, let me just take a few minutes to...
Senator from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me just take a few minutes to explain why I am once again objecting to the legislation just offered by my dear friend, my Finance Committee colleague from West Virginia. I want to make it absolutely clear that a long-term FAA reauthorization is a priority for this country, and it's a personal priority for me. Once again, I want to point out that I worked with Chairman Baucus on reporting a Finance Committee title to the bill that passed the Senate earlier this year. The current lapse in FAA taxes and expenditure authority from the Airport and Airway Trust Fund is a detrimental situation brought on by the Senate majority's refusal to discontinue granting excessive favors for big labor and their refusal to cut any wasteful spending. As I've already said, I share House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Mica's frustration that favors to organized labor have overshadowed the prospects for long-term FAA reauthorization. Last year, the National Mediation Board changed the rules under which employees of airlines and railroads are able to unionize. For decades, the standard has been that a majority of employees would have to agree in an election to form a union. However, the new National Mediation Board rules changed that standard so that all it takes to unionize is a majority of employees who vote or voting. This means that the NMB wants to count an employee who doesn't vote as voting for big labor. Somehow, organized labor is able to claim that it is democratic to appropriate someone else's vote without that person's input and participation. The FAA reauthorization bill that passed the House earlier this year undoes this heavy-handed rule and lets airline employees decide for themselves how to use their own votes. The House bill would merely undo a big partisan favor done at the behest of big labor and put efforts to unionize airline workforces on the same footing that they have been on for years. The House bill does not create a new hurdle to unionization. Instead, it restores the long-standing ability of airline employees to make decisions for themselves. The House bill only undoes the NMB action that was taken to reverse 70 years of precedent for narrow political gain. In addition to an impulse to cater to big labor, the Senate majority is also resistant to any attempt to cut any government spending, no matter how wasteful that spending may be. The House bill I'm going to ask unanimous consent for in a few minutes has aroused the ire of the majority because it contains a provision that would limit essential air service eligibility to communities that are located 90 or more miles from a large or medium hub airport. This would save $12.5 million a year. That's right, million with an M, not a B or a T. The majority is resisting a provision that already passed this body as part of the Senate's long-term reauthorization bill that would save $12.5 million a year, and they're willing to put the FAA's financing at risk in the process. The House bill I'm going to offer in a few minutes also contains an additional proposal to limit essential air service subsidies for communities where the cost per passenger is greater than $1,000. Now, this provision would affect a grand total of 3 airports in the whole country. It is my understanding that these 3 airports would also have ceased to receive EAS subsidies under another provision in the Senate-passed long-term FAA bill that limited subsidies to airports averaging 10 or more passengers a day. So to sum this up, our friends on the other side, the Democrats, are holding this up over wasteful spending and handouts for President Obama's big union allies. The point is that the Senate majority has cut the FAA off from its primary source of financing and created confusion for travel companies and tax-paying passengers by objecting to a short-term extension measure that does not do one single thing that is not done by a bill that passed the Senate by unanimous consent on April 7th of this year. Now, I want to briefly discuss and hopefully clear away some of that confusion. Passengers who bought tickets while the taxes were still being collected may be entitled to a refund if they are traveling during a period in which the taxes have elapsed. I want to make it clear that the inability of the Senate majority to process legislation should not constitute an additional burden to the already beleaguered travel industry. It is the responsibility of the Internal Revenue Service to refund ticket taxes, and while I recognize and want to do the right thing for taxpayers, I encourage the IRS to work closely with the travel industry. The travel industry is not responsible for the lapse in FAA taxes, and they shouldn't bear extra costs because of that. The lack of a long-term bill is bad for airports all across the country because they don't have the funding stability to plan and complete projects. Kicking the can further down the road is not a viable alternative to actually doing what is in the best interest of all parties. As a Senate conferee to the FAA bill, I stand ready to do everything I can to get to work with my House and Senate colleagues on a long-term FAA reauthorization just as soon as they are willing to get down to work. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of the House. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read a third time and passed, the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table, and that any statements relating to the bill appear at this point in the record.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President, I object.